Hi.
All right, good morning, everyone. Hello. And we've got another beautiful day here in Dallas today. Enjoy the weather before it gets cold again, right? Rotating through, it seems. So good to see all of you today, and those who are joining us by live stream and later as well. We're continuing our study in the book of Ruth today. And as has been my habit in this study, I want to begin with a brief poem by one of our co-authors of the study book we're using, Pedria Twanga? I just always struggle to say this name. Anyhow, this poem, and I promise it's brief, I only pick the brief ones, is titled, "We Are Not the Same." We are not the same. If we think we are, we end up playing games where dignity is dependent on some flimsy proof. And dignity is not a game that can be won or lost. Because we know this truth. Winners always define glory, and losers always suffer loss. Rather, we are us. Not because of anything, just because everything less than this demeans us. Anything less than this depletes us. And in this space of sharing, there are various types of people, loving people. And while we're not the same, our intrinsic worth is equal. We are less if we accept anything less than equal. Isn't that a beautiful poem? Wow. So impressed with that. Let me get over here. I've got to switch books in my library here. Well, if it will open, come on. And we're going to pick up today. You know, we're sort of going back and forth in the biblical text. But I want to extend us. We've only read out loud the first chapter of Ruth. And we've sort of been going back and forth through that. We're going to reach back into there a little bit today, but we're going to also reach forward into the first part of chapter 2. And so just to get that before us, if you're following along in your own Bible, if you want to just listen, I'm going to read the first part of Ruth chapter 2, okay? Now, Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech. Remember, Elimelech is Naomi's deceased husband, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." Side note, before we go on, I think most of y'all know what the word gleaning means, right? We bring this into English today in another way, in a non-agrarian way, to talk about whenever we read something, we glean insights from it, right? We pick up something from it. So gleaning in the Bible is this practice that's taught in the Hebrew Scriptures. It's one of God's commandments that the owners of fields, whenever they are harvesting the fields, are not to harvest everything. They're not to strip it bare. They're to leave the corners of the field for the poor and the hungry to come harvest some of what's there. Also, the command is not to, even in the area that they harvest, not to just completely take everything out, but to leave some chaff or other things there for others to come by and pick up as well. It is an ancient practice of sharing that's empowering to people because it's not giving them food, but it's allowing them to have the access to food, right? And that plays into this story. So for those of you who are all about a hand up and not a handout, that's this, right? That's what gleaning is all about in this context. So that's what's happening here with Ruth. So she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was, as we already know, of the family of Elimelech, just in case you missed it 2 verses earlier. Just then, enter Boaz, stage right. Boaz came from Bethlehem. This really does read like a drama, right? He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." So here's a Semitic greeting going on, right? Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, and here's a great, interesting line, "To whom does this woman belong?" To whom does this woman belong? Which is a reference in part to, it's a way of saying, who is she? But in this context, is she married to someone? Is she related to someone? And again, the plight of women in this culture is they are known by who they're attached to, right? And I hear in this phrase an echo of that line from the traditional marriage ceremony when the bride walks down the aisle, and in the past, the minister says, "Who gives this woman in marriage?" I never say that. I was counseling last week with a couple I'm going to do a wedding for in a couple of months, and I was explaining to them, as I do every couple, I looked at the bride and said, "I do not believe you're the property of anyone here." And so what we've changed that today to say is, when the father or whoever is walking the bride down the aisle in a traditional wedding service, who blesses this marriage? Her mother and I? The family and I? All of us do? Some answer like that, right? But we understand this language that's here, right? When he asked, "To whom does this woman belong?" And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." In case you didn't know she's from Moab, we're going to say it twice in one sentence. She said, again, this is like, "Oh, he's the Mexican who came from Mexico last week." That's what this is like. She said, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the reapers." So she came, and she has been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting for even a moment. Look at what's happening here. The supervisor is commending her for her work habits. He's commending her for being industrious. And why is this? Because there is a stereotype in the culture that Moabites are lazy, that Moabites are horrible people, that Moabites are just going to suck the life out of you, right? And this supervisor's view has changed because all of a sudden he sees this woman who's working really hard, and she defies the stereotype that he has of what a Moabite is. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them." And here's a line that transcends time. "I have ordered the young men not to bother you." Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what that means. There are a lot of spare corners in a field.
Yeah, my version says not to lay a hand on you.
That's right. That's actually what it means. Not to lay a hand on you, right? "If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." Then she fell prostrate. I always love saying that word because I make sure I'm not saying prostate. Okay. I remember to this day, the day I learned the difference between the word prostrate and prostate. I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, and I used it wrong in a sense, and our next door neighbor corrected me. I still remember it. Yeah. So embarrassing. She didn't fall prostrate, she fell prostrate with her face to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I am a foreigner?" But Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, may I continue to find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, even though I am not one of your servants. We're going to stop right there with that text. So part of what we see going on in today's text is breaking up stereotypes about people, right? And I think we've all had experiences where we have met people who were not what we thought they would be. And we've learned about people who've helped us break down our stereotypes. And, you know, 3 controversies ago in our lives, people would ask me, well, how do you get people to come around to supporting women in ministry? And one of the answers I gave, have one of their daughters get called to be a pastor. It's amazing when a man who believes women shouldn't be preachers suddenly has a daughter who has the call of God in her life, how sometimes that can change an attitude, right? And we can see this play out in other ways as well. I want to say, by way of illustration today, a word of tremendous commendation to our class member, Pat Spikes, who is engaged in one of these life-changing moments right now, I think.
I hope.
Pat has volunteered, and this ties into the sermon today as well, by the way, so you can have an extra illustration of George's sermon. Pat has volunteered through Gateway of Grace to work with some refugees here in Dallas. And what she's discovered is that the greatest need they have is not what she went to help them with initially. You know, there are ESL classes and there are all these things that we offer, but we often find that there's another need. And in this case, this family, this lovely family, has encountered an unjust landlord in a vicious Dallas real estate market who has unjustly evicted them from an apartment and trying to charge them for the remainder of the lease, or make them upgrade to an apartment that is nearly $1,000 more expensive a month that they can afford, while also trying to then rent the existing apartment to someone else for $600 more than they were paying for it. Unscrupulous, right? But here's Pat in the middle of this, desperately trying to help, trying to find a way to say this is unjust, right? And I think most of us, if we didn't know Pat and didn't know this situation, and some of us have been helping other people like this before, so we see it, but the common response is, well, they must have done something wrong, right? There must be more to this story. Well, it doesn't really matter. It's still unjust. It's still unjust. And here is our friend who's standing in the gap. And I think, Pat, you're being changed. Your spirit is growing through this. And you're helping someone. And this is the love of God that bears fruit. And it happens on an individual level. And here's what's happening to Boaz in this moment, right? Now, he may have ulterior romantic notions. We don't know for sure. It looks like it. But still, at this moment, he, and not only him, but those around him, they're having to break down a stereotype of who a Moabite is, right? And Ruth defies the stereotype. And they're having to come to grips with that. And good for them, they're adapting, right? Isn't that wonderful? Because when we come face to face with real people and their difficulties and their challenges and their humanity and their joys, it changes who we are, right? It's always so much easier to be a critic in the abstract.
You see the world from a different perspective.
That's right. Thank you, Pat. You see the world from a different perspective in this. And I think that's part of what we're seeing in this story today. Ruth, as our authors of the study book say, is a book that is set in the biblical narrative in the time of the judges. Now, we've talked about this a little bit, and one of the other things that's important to note is We mentioned previously that in parts of the Old Testament, the Jewish tradition arranges some of the books in a different order than the Christian tradition does. And Ruth is one of those that's in a different place. Because in the Jewish tradition, Ruth is organized within a set of 5 books that have to do with the festivals, right? And they sort of all get brought together. Whereas we have it inserted in a little bit of a more chronological way in the story. Because roughly, the Old Testament books, that as we know them, are arranged in chronological historical order. Sort of, but not entirely. I mean, you got problems with Isaiah, but that's a whole other story, right? So this is what's happening, because the children of Israel have asked God for help in this, and they're behaving horribly in this time. So the judges come to bear in Israel's history when it's like the Wild West. When people are taking the law into their own hands, they're doing all sorts of horrible things. And if you read the chapter 3 of the book, he goes into great detail describing this. I'm not going to rehash all that, right? But here's how he summarizes it. By the end of this relentless tale of horror and conflict, the tribes have turned in on themselves, and the book of Judges ends with the weary description that this was a time when, to quote, all the people did what was right in their own eyes. And then the book of Ruth appears right after this. And he says it becomes an interlude between the tales of war and empire building. And it offers us a respite in a story of love and loyalty. What an interesting happening that is in just the sequencing of this, right? What we see in Ruth it's a break from the savagery of the judges, but a contrast to this as well, right? But yet Ruth begins in a story of famine, as we've talked about before, right? We can't get rid of this trauma because it informs who we are. I had a call this week from Brent Newberry, one of our pastoral residents, who was calling on behalf of a friend of his who's interested in a particular church that has a pastorate open, that I know quite a bit about this church in another state, not here, not Wilshire. And he asked me what I could tell him about this church. And I said, well, to answer that question, I've got to go back 4 pastors. And I need to tell you about the fire that happened. And how 40 years later, everything that's happening in this church has to be traced back to the understanding of this fire. And all the events that happened after that thing, right? Because it so shaped the history and the narrative and the identity of this church. And in your family, you may have stories like this, where you may ask a grandparents, well, tell me about Aunt so-and-so. Well, let me tell you about Granny so-and-so, right? Because to get to Aunt so-and-so, you got to go all the way back to here. And we know these stories because they get buried in our lore, and they shape who we are, right? And even though time passes and we may change, and people are born who didn't know Granny whoever, right? But yet that story is still strong in the family tie. And that's what's happening here in the story of Ruth as well. Does that make sense? Anyone have...
Well, same thing in the sermon this morning, talking about the grandfather who died, and it affected the whole family as to whether there would be a church anymore. Right.
Yeah. Just consider this lesson a supplement to the sermon today. It's going to help you, right? A reminder that the famine happens in Bethlehem, and we said this before, but it bears saying again. The word Bethlehem means house of bread, and in the house of bread there's a famine. And this really struck me this week in thinking about Ukraine. And the more we read, the more we see, the more we hear. Here are people who literally one day had a very normal life, and the next day everything has changed. I was listening to some coverage of this week, and I just thought for the first time, is anybody still going to work in Ukraine? How could they? No, they can't. They've either left or they're in hiding, or they're fighting, right? So the entire economy of a country, almost the size of Texas, has ground to a halt because one madman has assaulted them and has the power to do that. This is a story of biblical proportions going on in our lifetime. It is unlike anything else I can compare in my knowledge of life. Yes, there have been other wars. They've been provoked, or there's been other things. Yes.
I was watching the CBS morning show on Sundays, does more feature stories than news blips. And the one they did this morning was on the kids and just all the children that are, and it showed a picture of a woman with like a 3-year-old and her cat. And that's what she grabbed when they left. And one of the things they said, that once this does finally calm down, the infrastructure of the country has been destroyed.
Yeah.
So even if the umpteen million people want to come back, there is no physical part of the country for them to come back to, because of the precision or lack thereof bombing that's happened. And so the infrastructure is gone, which therefore people can't go back to jobs and homes and
Which will affect for multiple generations down the line. This is how generational trauma plays out. Thank you, Johnny. This is a beautiful illustration. For those at home, she was talking about the infrastructure in Ukraine that's destroyed, and even if the war stopped today, you couldn't just go back and live there because so much destruction has happened, right? It is staggering to think about the scale of this, and there is, other than those of you who are alive at World War II and the great European exodus, right, and that's some of y'all, there has never been a greater sudden migration of people in our lifetime in the world. So here's some perspective on this. So many refugees from Ukraine have fled to Poland, and Poland is almost the size of California. So get California in your head, right, population-wise. You have a country like California. Now I want you to imagine the city of Phoenix, Arizona, across the border. If every living soul in Phoenix, within 2 weeks, up and moved to California, that's what's happened in Poland. And they've arrived with maybe a suitcase. One of the things that's stunning to me when you look at the photographs and video is you see people leaving, walking, and they're pulling behind them a suitcase like they're going to the airport. And they look just like one of us.
That scene somewhat reminds me of, was it Fiddler on the Roof, where the scene back there where people were walking across
Yeah.
Russia.
Yeah, Fiddler on the Roof is a great comparison because that's actually set in the same area. And there's some direct historical correlation to Fiddler on the Roof in the current situation. That's a whole interesting other conversation as well. Yeah. So I tell you all that to say, this is how the history between the Jews and the Moabites was dug in, right? Because it also had to do, and some of y'all mentioned this, you read this in the chapter and you mentioned it last week. There was a time when the Moabites had refused to offer food to the Israelites who were hungry.
During the Exodus.
Yeah, during the Exodus, right? And so that was a long time ago, but that memory still persisted. It was still, it shaped everything about this, right? And all of this has to do with, as with so many rifts in the world, ancient history that lives today, right? Even if we didn't experience the hurt ourselves, we carry it forward with us, right? And that's what's going on here. Does that make sense? Okay, we talked about that. Our author in chapter 3 talks about a direct application of this in Ireland to Great Britain, and particularly to England, and their subjugation in this. This is a fascinating line. The already strained relationship with the British Crown also worsened during the Troubles. Well, no, back during the potato famine. I'm sorry. Sectarian and ethnic tensions were stirred, and increasing diaspora, particularly in the United States, helped seed the growing threat of violence against British rule in Ireland. Stories survive of Protestant clergy establishing soup kitchens in Ireland to feed those displaced from the land who were mostly Catholic. You can't understand the division in Ireland without Protestant Catholic. In some cases, food was only provided on the condition that they convert to Protestantism. And those who did became known as soupers, or those who took the soup. The term continues to live on in the vernacular for someone who is disloyal or who changes allegiance. They are a super. See how that it just carries on. And yet, dear God, how many soup kitchens have I visited in my life that were run by Christians who demanded that you sit and listen to a sermon before you could have the soup? Not a great idea, in my humble opinion, right?
The pandemic's cut that out a little bit.
Yeah, the pandemic has changed that for sure, right?
Well, same thing with medicine as well. Sometimes the missionaries go down there, they've got medicine to treat people, but only if you become Christian or at least listen to their evangelizing.
Yeah, so let me just say, the model of Jesus in this is to heal first and ask questions later, right?
I was going to say, my dad was a doctor, and when we went to Africa, the first thing he did was treat people. And then we had services and everything, and I used to go with a lantern and ask people at the hospital if they wanted to go to our services. Because at night, you couldn't walk those paths without tripping or falling and stuff. And they would come. But I was to say, my dad did so much for those people without ever asking anything.
And that is the model of Christ, is to serve everyone, right? So the author of the co-author of our book says that it may be that the entire purpose of the book of Ruth, I love this phrase he uses, is to unpick the ancient stereotypes of Moabites that were so deeply woven into the fabric of history, tradition, and experience. Such a self-examination preserved in sacred text is a wondrous call. So often in contemporary politics, we see that voices of self-examination are derided for being unpatriotic. This is a global problem. It's not just an American problem, right? But yet, when we get to know people, we can change our attitudes about people. And we can break down these stereotypes. And so many organizations exist that try to do this. It's a starting point, right? It's a starting point in this.
Where are you in the book?
At the very end of chapter 3. Yeah.
To me, the saddest thing is we've spent the last, well, how long has it been since I graduated from high school?
You don't have to
A
tell us.
long time. That many years.
We'll just guess.
50-some. Trying to let go of our thought of Russians as the great evil.
Right. And
Was that a mistake? I mean,
So,
you know.
the comment here Linda's talking about is, for many of us who are older, there's so ingrained in us this notion of Russians as, the great evil. And this is the challenge, right? This is the challenge of this. Stereotyping, right? And the author says of this that the stereotyping becomes dangerous when we ignore differences between individuals in that people group. So even, let's say the worst thing you think about some people group is true, whatever that people group is. That doesn't mean every person in that people group is that way. And you probably have been in a situation where you have been judged because of you are something.
Yeah.
You're you're a certain age, you're a certain race, you're a certain height, you're a certain size, you're a certain whatever. And people make assumptions about you based on that before they get to know who you actually are. And we all do that. It's the human condition. But this is what the book of Ruth is trying to undo for us, right? Trying to help us take a look at individuals and not at groups, right? Does that make sense?
Mark?
Yeah.
One of the funniest memories I have of talking to someone who was curious about religion and wanted to ask me about my background and experience, and I tried to explain to her. I grew up Baptist, but I was Royal Baptist, and I go to Wilshire Baptist, trying to kind of explain some of the what that means within the greater historical context of being Baptist. And this was over the phone. And then she said, well, now if you're Baptist, you think thus and so. And if you're Baptist, you think thus and so.
Right.
Just think of all the drinking, dancing, stereotypes.
Right.
And I realized about 5-10 minutes in the conversation, she was on her computer and looking at a Wikipedia page.
Oh, wow.
Being Baptist. And so she was projecting she was taking some general information.
So it wasn't even her experience, it was just what she was reading.
Yeah.
What does
But she's taking
Wikipedia
this
say?
generalized-
And that's your research project this afternoon. Yeah, thank you, Henry. So the example Henry's giving is that he was talking to someone who's found out he was raised Baptist and was literally looking at a Wikipedia page while they were talking, trying to understand Baptist and coming up with all these stereotypes that he, of course, defies as well.
Yeah, but how often, just like it sounded like, no matter what he said, well, we believe this, we believe that, it didn't matter because they were going to believe as they had in their mind. I'm reading this from Wikipedia. Same thing if we're talking to someone, they say, what church you go to? And I say, Wilshire Baptist. And they just, oh, well. And you get lumped in with all the other Baptists and what they believe and where maybe their grandfather was Baptist. And
well, so Jim, the interesting thing about this, and here's an irony of modern culture. So many hip churches have taken a denominational name out of their names, but they're not typically the most inclusive churches.
No, not at all.
So it's a bit of a shell game, right? Because you think you're inclusive and you're going to bring people in by breaking down those labels, but most of these churches that are generic named are not inclusive in that same way, right? They carry their own baggage. And the irony is that some of the most welcoming, inclusive churches I know still have a denominational label in their name. Weird. Okay? All right. The author here says, the book of Ruth is also a radical theological act. It recognizes that the national stereotype of Moabites is overcome by a new story. Indeed, it is an acknowledgement that the new stories are always possible. And these news stories are not told on the level of nation states or whole people groups, but through personal and human encounter. In this way, the book demonstrates the enduring and transforming power of incarnation. And this brings us back to the whole notion of God's love demonstrated to us through the personal presence in the form of Jesus, right? It is the incarnation that changes us in this. It's so wonderful to think about this in a new way. Our guest, who's teaching across the hall right now in the interview and worship today, is from Bethlehem. And he makes a joke, and he'll probably do this at 11 too, about, he sort of was born, he grew up across the street from where Jesus was born. And that he thinks his great-great-great-great-great-great-grandmother probably babysat Jesus. Which is a great line, but what it does, it allows us to see this in a personal way. Because the point here is there have been Christians in Palestine since the time of Christ. And they're 1% of the population today, 1.7% of the population. Almost non-existent, but they're still there. and they didn't convert necessarily. They've been there from the beginning, right? But that too defies our stereotypes about Arabs and Jews and Christians, right? I think many Christians in America today are genuinely stunned to understand that there are Palestinian Christians.
One was our guide when we were over there.
Right? And that's probably the best way to learn. Right? Because again, it changes your perspective on everything. It defies our stereotype. And the greatest transformation in life, I think, happens whenever we're willing to open ourselves and hear someone else's story and learn in a new way. What other comments do you have about any of this for today? Anyone?
Well, Mark, back in 2012, I went to Israel with
Yes.
George, with that group.
Right.
Combined it with Temple Emmanuel. And we went into Bethlehem and we heard a pastor there, I believe it was at a Baptist church, that at the time, and he just expressed that they were the, most forgotten group of people ever, because no one thought about them, and they got, it was,
Right.
For a while, he said, the First Baptist Church of Dallas did provide some funding and books and literature and things, but he just said, you can't leave here as a Palestinian without getting special papers and authorization. You
Right.
just can't come and go. You're locked into the Bethlehem.
Right.
literally.
Yeah. So Marilyn, for those at home, Marilyn's talking about her experience visiting the Holy Lands and meeting a Palestinian Christian pastor there and understanding that story. This may be the same pastor who's here.
It might be.
Yeah, because this is the guy who runs the school that y'all visited,
Yeah.
the School for the Arts.
Okay, yeah, but I thought in the bulletin or the tapestry that it didn't have that, he was back.
Oh, he meant, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah. Carolyn?
When we went, it was a very long time ago, I won't say how long, but we went to both sides of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
And you had to go to one side first, because
Right.
if we went to the other side, you wouldn't be able to go to
Right.
that.
Yeah, it's so careful. Anything else about stereotypes and borders and boundaries? We're sort of at a natural stopping point for today. And
Good. I want to do something else.
okay. On camera or off?
Do you know what? Do on camera.
Okay, so Charlene's going to come, and then I'll come back and we'll say a prayer before we close out.
Okay, and I'm going to stand where I may even sit in this chair and hold my phone up, and I'm going to show you how to get to Realm on your phone. If you have done Realm, where you have signed into the church and you've downloaded the app, then I'm going to show you, and I'm going to show you how easy it is to get to the church directory. Because I want to salute our class this week for reaching out to people on their own. Some of it's been the groups that Pat has done. Some of it has been totally on your own. All right, so I am on my just regular page. I scroll over, and this is what Realm looks like. It's that little one at the, well, wait a minute.
You can download it from the App Store.
Yes, and it says Realm. It's the one on the far right. I'm going to touch it, and this is what comes up. Super Bowl of Carrot. Down at the bottom, it lists things that you can do. It doesn't say anything much, but if you go over to the far right, it says more. And then it gives me a list, and I can go groups. If I've been on a committee, it's going to tell me that. I could check into Sunday school, but I'm going to go to groups. I could have gone to the whole church directory right there.
Do you always have to have your password? What a pain in the neck.
I didn't.
No,
I
you
didn't
should- You
either.
should be able to set it on your phone where it would stay, it would keep you logged in.
All right, but then once you get to discover, so then it gives you your groups. I'm going to Discovery Class, and at the top, it shows if you have a picture that the class uses, that the church uses, it's gonna show that. You just touch those people at the top, and it then lists everybody in the class. You can go down and it can tell you anybody's information that's in the class.
And you can literally click through to call someone or email them.
Right from there.
It's so easy.
And and I am so grateful to the ones who are reaching out. And those of you at home, we want to keep up with you too. So I give it back
Yeah,
to you.
thank you. Again, thanks. We got some good stuff going on with contacts in the class, and
Oh, I have one other thing. I'm just gonna take over. Class party has been rescheduled for Saturday, April 23rd at noon in the James Gallery. And next week, I will appear with a list of those of you who have already paid and made a reservation, and we'll go forward from there. April 23rd.
April 23rd.
It's $15. The majority of you have already paid, and it's in a little envelope in the bottom of the cabinet. And, but I will let you know if you've paid.
That's
or
almost
not.
like a free lunch, because you forgot you even paid.
Because you paid so early.
You forgot you paid.
Why don't they update this?
Did you say
Super Bowl
noon?
carrying?
Yeah, I wouldn't pay attention to that part.
Yes,
Just
noon.
saying.
Yeah, I don't know.
All right,
What time
somebody,
is
Yeah.
noon on Saturday. Somebody can't find it in the App Store. Realm, REALM.
Yeah, we'll help you.
Okay.
Okay, we need to move on here. I'm gonna say a prayer for all of us, and then we'll come back with our prayer concerns here in the class for just a moment. Thank you, everyone. Lord, thanks for your guidance today and this wonderful discussion. Thank you for the manifestations we see among us and in others of your love being shared so boldly. And we pray you grant us the grace to all follow suit. Through Jesus, we pray. Amen.
All right.